Well, Lent began this week. 40 days of walking with Jesus toward the cross. And over the next few weeks, we'll be reading the gospel passages with the theme, A Questioning Faith. We're pretty good around here at applying a critical eye to texts and traditions. Familiar religious approaches to most anything are under microscopic scrutiny from time to time here at the Riverside Church. Can I get an amen? And that's a good thing, to question our faith. But this Lent, I'm afraid our questions are going to be turning inward. During this season of self-examination, we'll be gathering the courage to ask ourselves some questions posed by the lectionary text and touching on some of the deepest and most difficult of our human experiences. This season, we're using the guide to our gospel passages provided by the Revised Common Lectionary. For those unfamiliar, the lectionary is a 3-year cycle of assigned passages followed by many churches in the Christian world. It's a place to start with our holy texts every week. I say that to prove that I did not intentionally choose Valentine's Day to assign today's question, can I resist temptation? When I was a kid, my grandmother lived with us for half of every year. It was always fun for us to have my dad's mother right there with us. I'm not so sure that my mother felt the same way. See, Grandma had her sacrosanct routines. Grape nut cereal with bananas for breakfast every morning, Mass very early on Sunday mornings, and as she called them, my shows. Every weekday, beginning about 11 a.m., no one was allowed to interrupt Grandma, who would be glued to the television for several hours watching her favorite soap operas. Maybe you had a grandma like this too. If you did, then you and I might share a common soundtrack of childhood. You remember the dramatic voiceover at the beginning of every episode of The Days of Our Lives, with the picture of an hourglass and the haunting recitation,
like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives.
I knew Jim Reed could do it better than I could. That soundtrack kept running through my mind this week as we dimly lit the nave and mixed the ashes for Ash Wednesday and did all that we do around here to get ready for Lent, because if there's any liturgical season in which to be mindful of the fleeting nature of our lives, in which to summon the courage to ask the hard questions, this is it. Today we're asking, can I resist temptation? And our gospel lesson tells us the story of Jesus spending 40 days in the desert, where the text tells us he fasted and prayed and was constantly tempted by the devil. It's a story we read every year on this first Sunday of Lent. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include some version of the story, so it must be important. Jesus in the desert for 40 days should make all the biblical scholars in this room immediately know that there are some deep allusions here to a larger story. The people of Israel, remember, spent 40 years in the wilderness, the desert, wandering around trying to find their way to the promised land. The prophet Elijah spent 40 days in the wilderness too, waiting for the voice of God. And Moses hung out for 40 days in the wilderness until God gave him the law. This reference to 40 days in the desert carries with it deep meaning to symbolize a time of waiting in a desolate place, a wild place, a place of total dependence, a place to grapple with questions, a place to wait for answers to emerge. 40 days, just like the season of Lent. Today's story appears in Luke's gospel right after Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, ready to get on with saving the world, when Luke tells us the Spirit led Jesus into the desert, For 40 days, he was all alone in that desolate place without food to eat, alone with his own thoughts and fears and hopes and doubts. Alone, the text says, except for the devil, Satan, the embodiment of all the doubts Jesus had about who he was and what he was meant to do in his life. Like all of us, Jesus was seeking meaning for his human experience. He had questions, doubt, deep wondering about what his life would mean. The devil must have known it too, because he tried to get Jesus right in the most vulnerable places. First, knowing Jesus was very hungry after his starvation diet of 40 days, the devil taunted him with an offer of bread. Stale bread in a hot, dry desert doesn't sound appealing to me, even if Jesus had some hot sauce in his bag. Still, you know his stomach had to be rumbling. If you're really the Son of God, like you say you are, then why not turn these stones into bread? Everybody needs something to eat. The second temptation was to show Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and tell them they're yours for the taking. Just worship me, the devil said, and I'll give them to you. Think what you could do with all of the kingdoms of the world. There wouldn't be any inconvenient tussles with authorities for you to deal with. No controversial Supreme Court justice nominations. No threat of death, nothing like that. You'll have all the stuff you need to make yourself feel secure. And the third temptation presented to Jesus was identity. Throw yourself off the temple and show the world that the angels will catch you. Everyone will see how powerful and prestigious and righteous you are. And they won't have any doubts that you're the Son of God then. It'll be a much quicker way to impress folks than, say, walking around the countryside telling them to love their enemies and crazy stuff like that. Almost all the scholars who write commentary on this text take the approach of breaking down these three temptations and finding each of their deeper meanings. There are books written about each one of these temptations and why the devil chose this one and what it symbolizes for us. I prefer today, though, to keep it simple because it seems to me that there's something that all three of these temptations have in common, and maybe it's something as we start this 40-day journey through the desert of Lent ourselves, to which we should pay attention. That commonality is distraction. Distraction from the real and painful internal work of finding out who we are in this world and who we're meant to be. None of what the devil tempts Jesus with is necessarily bad. We need food to survive. We work hard to provide for ourselves and our families. We struggle to be good people with good reputations. But sometimes that internal work of vulnerability and honesty sends us running for the hills, and our well-intended efforts veer off into destructive temptation. The temptation to make the good the enemy of the great, to use the rhythm of our lives to drown out those questions that are so painful to ask. Can you see it? This Lent, you might be giving some thought to who you really are and how to make your life meaningful, but here's the distraction. A voice says, don't be silly. That's too much work. It's painful and hard to live with intention. Instead, here, why don't you exercise more? That'll help you not think about it. Or why don't you use other people for your own pleasure with no concern for their well-being? That'll distract you. Or as Brene Brown says with such eloquence, have another beer and a banana nut muffin. This Lent, perhaps, you hope to ask some hard questions, to carve out some time to think about how to intentionally build a life that reflects God's hope for the whole world. But then the distraction appears. Why don't you get your mind off things by making sure you have enough stuff? Staunch that fear of living intentionally by going shopping and bringing home to your already overcrowded apartment all that stuff. And by spending your time worried about keeping the money you have and amassing more, and by buying that new whatever because it feels good, then desperately clutching on to all the stuff you have in an attempt to feel secure in a world that's changing radically all around you. That would be a good idea. Or this Lent, maybe you're ready to look in the mirror and be honest. To be honest with yourself about who you really see staring back at you. But then the voice of distraction sounds again. That's gonna be really painful. If you change the way you see yourself, it might change what other people think about you. It might force you to honestly confront who you really are. Instead, here's an idea. Go to school a lot. Get a whole bunch of diplomas and hang them on your wall. Build professional acclaim that will define who you are for the world and save you the trouble of having to do it yourself. Fill your life with work. Work, 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 and whatever prestigious volunteer position you happen to hold. That'll really help you distract yourself from the feeling that you might not be good enough, that you're not worthy just the way you are. And work really hard at climbing the social ladder. If you do that, then everybody will think you're somebody. And maybe, just maybe, you won't have to look too closely in the mirror yourself. Distraction. It might be the most alluring temptation of all. Right there at the beginning of his ministry, his true meaning and purpose spread out before him like the challenge they were. Jesus was tempted by distraction. All the voices around him urged him not to do the work that it takes to live intentionally, to model God's radical love for the world. There was plenty to take his attention away, and there is plenty to take our attention away. This season, 40 days of reflection, of walking alongside Jesus in the desert and feeling the constant temptation of distraction. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the Lenten wilderness. Temptation will surely meet us there, but what happened to Moses and Elijah and Jesus and the Israelite people in their desert sojourns will certainly happen to us. God will be with us right here in the fear-filled wandering of Lent. And God will persist. God will insist on the joyful and painful process of formation, of shaping and changing us into people whose lives reflect God's radical love, if only we will resist the ever-present temptation of distraction, pulling us away from asking the hard questions. As we begin these 40 days of Lent, it's more than the chocolate we promised to give up that is calling to us, tempting us to give in. It's all of the distractions of this world that lure us into lives of complacency and numbness, of living day in and day out with no intention whatsoever. And as we watch Jesus resist the attraction of all these things he could have used to distract him from the very purpose for which he was created, we must acknowledge that we can and we do face the very same temptation. We so very often distract ourselves from the real work of living intentional and faithful lives. Our question today is, can we resist temptation? I'm not really talking about chocolate or indiscriminate sex or alcohol or red meat. I'm talking about something deeper. The temptation to give in to distraction, to set the hard internal work of Lent aside and glide on the surface till we land at Easter. But if you and I want to be people who live faithfully and intentionally in this world, then we can't afford to waste any time in the task of becoming who we're called to be. In these next 40 days, can you resist the temptation to distraction? It's an important question to ask ourselves because life is fleeting and like sands through the hourglass, so are the days of our lives. Amen.